Ex-millionaire's wife pulls off scam at his company, but the cleaning woman changes everything. Richard Thompson was in his New York City office when the phone rang with the call that would change his life forever. His company, built over 25 years of hard work, had lost $50 million in a single bank transfer. That's when he discovered that his ex-wife, Vanessa, had used old powers of attorney he'd forgotten to revoke after the divorce. While Richard traveled to a business fair in Chicago, she broke into the company accounts and transferred everything to overseas accounts. "Mr. Richard, you need to see this," said Margaret Williams, interrupting his desperate thoughts. The 52-year-old woman in her dark blue uniform and impeccable white apron held some papers in her calloused hands. Margaret had worked as a cleaner at the company for 15 years, always arriving before everyone else and leaving last. "Not now, Margaret. I'm dealing with a very serious problem," Richard replied, running his hands through his graying hair. "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about. I saw your ex-wife here at the company last week, going through documents in your office." Richard jerked his head up. Vanessa at the company. She no longer had access after the bitter divorce they'd had 2 years ago. "What do you mean, Margaret? What day was that?" "It was last Tuesday, very late at night. I was cleaning the upstairs floor when I heard noise down here. I thought it was you working late as always, but when I came down to clean your office, it was her. She was going through your files and computer." Richard felt his stomach drop. Tuesday was exactly 2 days before his trip to Chicago. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Margaret lowered her eyes, embarrassed. "I tried calling you on Wednesday, but your secretary said not to bother you with cleaning matters. I thought about telling you when you returned from your trip, but then all this happened." Bitterness overwhelmed Richard. Once again, someone had tried to warn him about something important and was ignored. The same thing happened when some employees tried to alert him about irregularities in the financial department months ago. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I should have listened to you. Now tell me everything, every detail of what you saw." The cleaning woman sat in the chair opposite the mahogany desk, something she had never done in 15 years of work. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the papers she had brought. "She was with a man in a dark suit, about your age. They were looking at some documents and he was showing her something on the computer. I heard him talking about powers of attorney and bank transfers." Richard leaned forward. A man in a suit? Vanessa hadn't mentioned anyone new in her life during the divorce proceedings. "Would you recognize this man if you saw him again?" "I think so. He had well-cut hair, prescription glasses, and spoke like a lawyer. You know how they talk, right? With those difficult words." A lawyer. Richard felt a chill down his spine. Vanessa had always said she didn't need her own lawyer because she trusted him, that they could work everything out amicably. Now he discovered she had legal help all along. "Margaret, you said you brought some papers. What are they?" The cleaner extended a yellowed plastic folder. "When they left, I went to clean your office and found these pages fallen behind the desk. They must have dropped them without noticing. I kept them because they seemed important, but I don't understand any of these things." Richard opened the folder and his breath caught. They were copies of internal company documents, including the powers of attorney he had signed years ago when he was still married to Vanessa. The papers had handwritten notes with amounts and bank account numbers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. My goodness, Margaret. They've been planning this for weeks. Look here, there's even a schedule for when to execute each transfer. Margaret approached the desk, her brown eyes full of concern. "Mr. Thompson, there's one more thing. I wrote down the license plate of the car they used. I thought it might be important." Richard looked at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time in 15 years. That woman, whom he always politely greeted, but never truly noticed, had collected more evidence in one night than he had in days of desperation. "Margaret, do you realize you may have saved my company?" The cleaning lady shook her head modestly. "I just did what anyone would do. You've always been fair to me. Gave me a job when no one else wanted to hire a woman my age. When my husband got sick, you gave me leave to care for him without docking my pay. Now it's my turn to help." Richard felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. Amid the chaos of his life, There was someone loyal, someone who genuinely cared about him. We need to go to the police station immediately. With this evidence, we might be able to trace the money before it's permanently transferred overseas. Mr. Thompson, before we go, may I make a suggestion? Margaret seemed hesitant, as if about to cross some invisible barrier between employer and employee. Of course, go ahead. I've been studying law at night for 4 years. I started after my husband passed away, wanted to better understand my rights as a worker. I've learned some things about international bank transfers. If your ex-wife made these transfers on Tuesday, they might still be in the clearing period. We have a window of time to contest them. Richard was speechless. Margaret was studying law. In 15 years of knowing her, he never knew this. Once again, he realized how little he knew about the people who worked for him. Margaret, why did you never tell me you were studying? The woman smiled timidly. Who would be interested in the dreams of a 52-year-old cleaning lady? Besides, I didn't want you to think I was unhappy with my job here. Unhappy? Margaret, you're saving me. If you have any ideas about how to proceed, I'm all ears. Margaret straightened up in her chair, and for the first time in 15 years, Richard saw confidence in her eyes. First, we need to find out exactly where the money went. Then we need to prove that the powers of attorney were used fraudulently, and most importantly, we need to find this lawyer who was with your ex-wife. Richard picked up the phone and called his own lawyer, Mr. Daniel Stevens, who had handled his business for over a decade. Daniel, I need you at the office now. It's urgent. While they waited, Richard and Margaret organized all the evidence. The cleaning lady showed impressive analytical skills, arranging the documents chronologically and highlighting important points that Richard had missed. Look here, Mr. Thompson. This note says, confirm with DS about 72-hour window. Who would DS be? Richard examined the paper. I have no idea. Could be anyone. What if it was the lawyer who was with her? DS could be his initials. When Mr. Stevens arrived, he found Richard and Margaret bent over a mountain of papers, like two detectives working on a case. Richard, I got your desperate message. What happened? Richard explained the whole situation while Mr. Stevens analyzed the documents. The lawyer, a 60-year-old man with graying hair and reading glasses, seemed increasingly worried. Richard, this is more serious than you think. Your ex-wife didn't act alone. This was a scheme planned and executed by someone who knows banking legislation very well. Margaret spoke up for the first time since Mr. Daniel Stevens had arrived. Mr. Stevens, excuse me. I saw the lawyer who was helping her. A man in a dark suit, glasses, well-groomed hair. The initials DS appear several times in these papers. Mr. Stevens looked at Margaret and then at Richard, clearly confused about who that woman was. Margaret is our cleaner, but she was the one who discovered everything and collected this evidence. She also studies law, Richard explained. I see. Margaret, you said DS. Interesting. May I see where these initials appear? Margaret showed the documents and Mr. Stevens turned pale. Richard, I'm afraid I know this DS Daniel Scott, a colleague, or rather, a former colleague. He lost his license to practice law 3 years ago for unethical practices. He specialized in scams against divorced businessmen. Silence filled the room. Richard felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Are you saying Vanessa sought me out already, knowing she was going to rob me? It's possible. Daniel has a history of approaching women going through divorces and convincing them to pull scams on their ex-husband businessmen. Margaret rose from her chair, determined. Then we need to act fast. If this Daniel has experience in this, he knows exactly how to hide the money and make recovery impossible. Mr. Stevens looked at Margaret with renewed respect. You're right. Richard, we need to file for an immediate court injunction to freeze all accounts related to Vanessa, and I need to make some calls to international banks. Mr. Stevens, may I suggest one more thing? Margaret interrupted again. Of course. I remember when they were here, the man mentioned something about the contact in Miami. If the money went to international accounts, it might be going specifically to the United States. Mr. Stevens quickly took notes. Margaret, you're being more helpful than many professional detectives. Richard, I'll need a power of attorney to act on your behalf internationally. As Mr. Stevens made urgent calls, Richard watched Margaret meticulously organizing all the documents. There was something about the dedicated way she worked that touched him deeply. "Margaret, may I ask a personal question?" "Of course, Mr. Richard. Why do you care so much about me? I mean, you could have just ignored everything you saw and gone on with your life normally." Margaret stopped organizing the papers and looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Richard, when my husband Anthony got sick, the doctors said he needed a very expensive medicine. I didn't have the money, and no bank wanted to give me a loan because I was just a cleaner. You didn't hesitate when I asked for help. You gave me the money and said I could pay it back when I could. No interest, no rush." Richard vaguely remembered the episode, but had no idea of the impact it had caused. "Anthony lived 2 more years because of that medicine. 2 years I would never have had with him if it weren't for your generosity. Now you're going through hard times, and I have knowledge that can help. It's as simple as that." Richard felt his eyes well up. Amid so many people who had betrayed and abandoned him, there was someone who remembered his kindness and was willing to repay it. "Margaret, regardless of what happens with the money, I want you to know that you changed everything for me today. Not only for uncovering the scam, but for showing me that there are still loyal people in this world." Mr. Stevens returned to the table with a grave expression. "I have bad news and good news. The bad news is that part of the money has already been transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The good news is that I managed to block approximately 30 million that were still in transitional accounts." Richard sighed in relief. 30 million wasn't everything, but it was enough to save the company from immediate bankruptcy. "What about the other 20 million? "That will be more complicated. We'll need to prove international fraud, and that could take months or even years. But Margaret might have given us a crucial clue by mentioning Miami." Margaret spoke up again. "Mr. Stevens, may I suggest something? What if we try to contact this Daniel Scott directly? If he lost his license, he might need money too. Desperate people make mistakes. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." Richard looked at Margaret with admiration. She was thinking like a true strategist. "Margaret is right. Daniel was always greedy. If he's behind this, he'll want to secure his share of the money as quickly as possible," agreed Mr. Stevens. "How do you suggest we approach this?" Margaret leaned forward, her eyes shining with determination. "What if I pretended to be a potential client, someone who also wants to pull off a similar scam? I could say I heard about him through Vanessa, and that I have a similar situation." Mr. Stevens shook his head vehemently. "No, that's too dangerous. Margaret, you're a civilian. You're not trained for this kind of operation." "But I have something you don't," Margaret replied. "He's never seen me before, and I know all the details of the scam they pulled off. I can be convincing." Richard felt torn. On one hand, the idea of Margaret putting herself at risk terrified him. On the other, she had shown impressive cleverness so far. "Margaret, it's very risky. If Daniel suspects you, he could erase all the evidence and disappear with the money." "Mr. Thompson, I raised 2 daughters alone after my first husband abandoned me, took care of a sick husband for 3 years, have been working since I was 15, and I'm studying law at 52. If there's one thing I know how to do, it's deal with men who think they're smarter than me." The determination in Margaret's voice was palpable. Richard realized he was facing a woman much stronger and more capable than he had ever imagined. "Mr. Stevens, theoretically, if Margaret managed to get recordings of Daniel confessing to the scheme, would that be legally valid?" "If done properly, with the right legal precautions, yes. But I insist it's extremely dangerous." Margaret was already picking up her purse. "Then let's do it right. Mr. Stevens, you can guide me on the legal aspects. Mr. Thompson, you can provide financial backing to make me seem convincing. And I'll get the confession you need." Richard looked at Mr. Stevens, who sighed resignedly. "If you're determined to do this, then let's at least minimize the risks. Margaret, you'll need a professional recorder, a convincing identity, and a safe location for the meeting." Over the next 2 hours, the three developed a detailed plan. Margaret would pose as Susan Roberts, a woman divorced from a construction businessman who had learned about Daniel through Vanessa. Richard arranged elegant clothes for Margaret, an expensive cell phone, and fake documents that Mr. Stevens knew about from other cases. They also rented a furnished apartment in an upscale neighborhood to serve as Susan's address. When Margaret came out of the office bathroom wearing a light suit, her hair styled sophisticatedly and with subtle makeup, Richard barely recognized her. "Margaret, you're unrecognizable. You look like a real businesswoman." "That's because I am a real businesswoman, Mr. Thompson. I just never had the chance to show it before." Mr. Daniel Stevens briefed Margaret on all the legal aspects she needed to know, and Richard trained her on how to sound convincing when talking business. "Remember, Margaret, the goal is to get Daniel to confess that he orchestrated the scam against me, that he's done this to other business owners, and most importantly, to find out where the rest of the money is." Margaret nodded, visibly nervous but determined. "Mr. Thompson, may I ask one thing? If anything goes wrong, please take care of my daughter Kathy. She's still in university and will need help finishing her degree." Richard held Margaret's hands. "Nothing will go wrong, and when this is over, I will personally ensure Kathy has everything she needs to graduate." Margaret smiled and went out to make the call that would change everything. "Hello, Mr. Daniel Scott. My name is Susan Roberts. I heard through Vanessa that you might be able to help me with a complex marital problem." On the other end of the line, Daniel bit the bait immediately. "Vanessa? Oh yes, of course. And what would your situation be, Mrs. Roberts?" "I'd prefer not to discuss it over the phone. Could you see me at your office tomorrow? I can tell you up front that my ex-husband owns a construction company valued at around 80 million. Daniel scheduled the meeting for the next day, late afternoon, at an office he maintained in Soho. That night, Richard could barely sleep. He was afraid of the risks Margaret was taking, but he also felt a growing admiration for that extraordinary woman who had appeared in his life at the most difficult time. The next day, Margaret arrived at Daniel's office promptly at 5 in the afternoon. The place was small but well decorated, clearly designed to impress clients. Daniel was exactly as Margaret had described him, a middle-aged man, well-dressed, with prescription glasses, and an overly confident smile. "Mrs. Roberts, it's a pleasure to meet you. Vanessa told me some very interesting things about your situation." Margaret discreetly activated the recorder in her purse. "Mr. Scott, I'll be direct. My ex-husband believed our divorce was amicable, but the truth is, I want to recover what is rightfully mine. Vanessa told me you have very effective methods." Daniel leaned forward, interested. "I see. And what exactly is your current legal situation?" "I signed some documents when we were still married, powers of attorney and things like that. Vanessa said you managed to use similar documents to recover 50 million from her ex-husband." "Ah yes, Richard Thompson. That was an interesting case. We managed to execute the transfers without him noticing until it was too late." Margaret felt her heart race. Daniel had confessed his involvement in the scam without even realizing it. "How did you manage to do that?" Daniel smiled presumptuously. "I developed a specific methodology. First, we identify all the valid powers of attorney the person signed during the marriage. Then we analyze the company's bank accounts and the periods when the target usually travels. Timing is essential. And the money? How do you ensure it can't be traced? Well, that's the most delicate part. We have a network of intermediary accounts, some overseas. Richard's money, for example, is safe in Miami, in an account he will never be able to locate." Margaret could barely contain her excitement. Daniel was giving away crucial information. "And how much do you charge for this type of service?" "Normally 40% of the recovered amount. In Richard's case, my share was 20 million. Vanessa got 30, but she has some expensive habits that need funding." "Habits?" Daniel lowered his voice. "Online gambling. She owes a fortune to international betting sites. Actually, that's how we met. I also work recovering debts for some of these sites." Margaret realized she had discovered the real motivation behind the scam. Vanessa wasn't simply being greedy. She was desperate to pay gambling debts. "Interesting. And have you applied this scheme in other cases?" "Of course, Richard was the 5th this year. We have a 100% success rate. The secret is choosing arrogant men who underestimate their ex-wives and don't pay attention to employees." Daniel Scott kept talking for another 20 minutes, detailing previous schemes and revealing names of other victims. Margaret got all the information Richard and Mr. Daniel Stevens needed. When she left Daniel Scott's office, Margaret was shaking with adrenaline. She had gotten enough evidence to not only recover Richard's money, but potentially help other victims of Daniel Scott's scams. Richard and Mr. Daniel Stevens were waiting anxiously in the office when Margaret arrived. "How did it go?" Richard asked immediately. Margaret smiled and pulled the recorder from her purse. "I got everything." He confessed to having orchestrated the scam, revealed where the money is, and even confessed to other similar crimes. Mr. Daniel Stevens took the recorder with trembling hands. "Margaret, you were brilliant. With these recordings, we will not only recover Richard's money, but we will put Daniel Scott in jail." Richard stood up and impulsively hugged Margaret. "Margaret, I don't know how to thank you. You risked your life for me." "Mr. Richard, it's not over yet. Daniel Scott mentioned that Vanessa has huge online gambling debts. If we pressure her with this information, she might cooperate to completely hand over Daniel Scott." "Mr." Daniel Stevens nodded. "Margaret is right. Victims of gambling addiction are often willing to make deals to avoid worse consequences." "How do you suggest we approach Vanessa?" Margaret thought for a moment. "What if I approached her as Susan Roberts? I can say Daniel Scott gave me her contact, that I'm facing similar problems with gambling debts, and that I need her experience." Richard frowned. "Margaret, you've already risked too much. I can't let you do this again." "Mr. Richard, Vanessa doesn't know me, and now I understand her situation. Women addicted to gambling often feel very isolated and guilty. If I appear as someone who understands the problem, she might open up to me." Mr. Daniel Stevens considered the proposal. "It might actually work. If Vanessa confesses that she was pressured by the gambling debts, it might even reduce the charges against her and make her more willing to cooperate." Richard was still reluctant, but he recognized the logic of the strategy. "All right, but this time I'll be nearby. No you facing this alone." Margaret agreed, and they scheduled a meeting with Vanessa for the next day at a cafe in the Fifth Avenue area. When Margaret arrived at the cafe, she found Vanessa sitting at a table in the back, visibly nervous. Richard's ex-wife had lost weight since the divorce and had deep, dark circles under her eyes. "Vanessa, I'm Susan Roberts. Daniel Scott gave me your contact." Vanessa looked at Margaret suspiciously. "Daniel Scott said you have a problem similar to mine, but I didn't quite understand what that means." Margaret sat down and discreetly activated the recorder. "Vanessa, can I be frank with you? I owe a lot of money to online betting sites, a whole lot. And Daniel Scott said you understand this situation." Vanessa's face completely changed. The suspicion was replaced by an expression of relief and identification. "My God, you two. How much do you owe?" "About 2 million. And you?" Vanessa lowered her head, ashamed. 4.8 million. I started betting small amounts when Richard and I were still married. At first I was even winning, but then it was an avalanche." "How did you manage to hide this from him?" "Richard traveled a lot for business. I used corporate credit cards, sold jewelry. I even took out loans in the company's name. When he discovered some of the debts, I lied and said they were expenses for decoration and clothes." Margaret pretended to understand and empathize. It must have been awful carrying that secret alone. "You have no idea. I woke up every day thinking about how to get more money to gamble and try to recover what I had lost. It was a terrible, vicious cycle." "And how did you meet Daniel?" Vanessa sighed deeply. "He represents some of the websites where I had debts. When I couldn't pay anymore, they sent him to collect from me. But instead of pressuring me, he offered a solution." "What solution?" "Daniel said he knew a way for me to get enough money to pay off all my debts and still have an amount to start over. All I needed to do was use some powers of attorney that Richard had signed when we were married." Margaret felt a mix of pity and indignation. Vanessa had been both a victim and a criminal. "And you accepted?" "I was desperate, Susan. The collectors were threatening me and I didn't see any other way out. Daniel said Richard would never need to know, that the money would be considered part of the divorce settlement. But you transferred 50 million. That's not a settlement, it's theft." Vanessa began to cry. I know that now. At first, Daniel said it would be just 10 million, enough to pay my debts. But then he said we needed to take more to cover the international fees and his fees. Margaret realized that Daniel had manipulated Vanessa as much as he had stolen from Richard. Vanessa, where is the money now? Daniel said it's in secure accounts in the Cayman Islands, but I never saw proof. He has only given me 15 million so far, said the rest will come gradually to avoid raising suspicions. Margaret leaned forward. Vanessa, can I ask you a question? Do you trust that Daniel will actually give you the 30 million he promised? I don't know. He's been a bit evasive lately. Said he has other more urgent cases. What if I told you there is a way for you to get out of this situation without going to jail and still get help for your gambling addiction? Vanessa raised her head, hopeful. What do you mean? Vanessa, my name isn't Susan. I'm Margaret Williams. I've worked for Richard for 15 years. I'm here because Richard wants to recover the company's money, but also because I believe you were manipulated by Daniel. Vanessa turned pale and tried to get up, but Margaret gently held her arm. Calm down, Vanessa. I'm not here to attack you. I'm recording our conversation, but I can help you. You tricked me. I'm calling the police. Vanessa, stop and think. Daniel promised you 30 million, but he's only given you 15. Do you really think he will keep the agreement? He is a professional criminal who has pulled this scam on other people. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Vanessa sat down again, clearly shaken. What are you suggesting? Richard has a very good lawyer. If you cooperate, confess everything, and help recover the money, it's possible to negotiate so that you aren't criminally prosecuted. In return, you receive treatment for your gambling addiction and a chance to start over. And why would Richard do that for me? I betrayed him in the worst possible way. Margaret looked directly into Vanessa's eyes. Because Richard is a good person who understands that you were also a victim of Daniel, and because I will convince him that everyone deserves a second chance. Vanessa fell silent for several minutes, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. If I agree to cooperate, what exactly do I need to do? First, tell me the whole truth about where the money is. Second, help record a conversation with Daniel where he confesses to the crimes. Third, agree to enter a treatment program for gambling addiction. And what if Daniel finds out I'm cooperating? Margaret leaned forward. Vanessa, you're in danger either way. Daniel won't share the money with you. He'll disappear and leave you facing all the consequences alone. By cooperating with us, at least you have legal protection. Vanessa took a deep breath. All right, I accept. But I need assurance that Richard won't press criminal charges against me. Margaret smiled. Vanessa, I can assure you that Richard is the kind of man who believes in redemption. If you truly cooperate and seek help, he will support your recovery. They spent the next 2 hours talking, with Vanessa revealing all the details of Daniel's scheme. Margaret discovered there were at least 6 other victims and that Daniel maintained a complex network of international bank accounts. When Margaret returned to Richard's office, she brought information that completely changed the case. Richard, Mr. Stevens, Vanessa has agreed to cooperate, and the information she gave me is even more important than we imagined. Richard seemed torn between relief and confusion. Margaret, how did you manage to convince her? I showed her that Daniel was using her just as much as he used you. Vanessa is addicted to online gambling and was being blackmailed and manipulated. She's also a victim, even though she committed crimes. Mr. Stevens analyzed Margaret's notes. Margaret, this information about Daniel's other victims is pure gold. We can build a federal criminal case that will put him in prison for decades. What about the money? Richard asked. Good news. Vanessa has access to some of the accounts where Daniel hid the money. She can help us recover not only your 50 million, but potentially the money stolen from other victims too. Richard was impressed. Margaret, in 3 days you've discovered more about this crime than I could have in months. How can I repay everything you've done for me? Margaret smiled modestly. Mr. Richard, I just want justice, and perhaps an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? When all this is over, I'd like to finish my law degree and maybe work in financial fraud investigation. I've discovered I have a talent for it. Richard looked at Margaret with renewed admiration. Margaret, when this is over, I want you as a partner in the firm. We'll create a compliance and internal investigation department, and you'll run it. Mr. Stevens interrupted the moment. Everyone, we need to act quickly. With Vanessa's information, we can arrest Daniel before he disappears with the money. In the following hours, they developed a plan to capture Daniel. Vanessa would call him saying she had found a new potential victim, a wealthy businesswoman going through a complicated divorce. Richard insisted on hiring professional security to protect both Margaret and Vanessa during the operation. Margaret, this time I won't take no for an answer. You've already risked too much. Let's do this as safely as possible. Margaret agreed, recognizing that Daniel could react violently if he discovered he was being tricked. The next morning, Vanessa called Daniel. Daniel, I found a perfect client for you. She owns a chain of private schools, is going through a divorce, and has powers of attorney similar to mine. Interesting. What's her net worth? About 100 million. And she's desperate because her husband found out about her extramarital affair. Daniel Scott had scheduled a meeting for that afternoon at a restaurant in the Upper East Side. Margaret prepared once again to play the role of a wealthy, desperate woman. This time, Richard insisted on being at the restaurant, along with security disguised as regular customers. When Margaret arrived at the restaurant, Daniel was already waiting, accompanied by another man she didn't recognize. Mrs. Margaret, Daniel stood up politely. This is my associate, Charles Parker. Margaret greeted both men, immediately sensing that something was different. Daniel seemed tense and suspicious. Mr. Scott, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Vanessa told me wonderful things about your services. Yes, Vanessa is a very satisfied client, but I need to ask a few questions before we proceed. Margaret discreetly activated the recorder and noticed that Richard was sitting 2 tables away pretending to read a newspaper. Of course, ask whatever you like. First question, how exactly did you meet Vanessa? Margaret felt a chill down her spine. The question implied that Daniel was suspicious. We met in a support group for divorced women. She mentioned that she had managed to recover money she considered rightfully hers. Interesting. Second question. Can you show me the power of attorney documents your husband signed? Margaret had prepared fake documents, but realized Daniel was testing her story much more aggressively than the first time. Of course, I brought copies. Daniel examined the documents for several minutes, taking notes. Margaret, can I be frank with you? Of course. I recently discovered that some people are trying to frame me for activities I never committed. There's a campaign to damage my reputation, using people who pretend to be potential clients. Margaret felt her heart race. Daniel was suspecting her. What kind of campaign? People with recorders asking specific questions to try to make me confess to imaginary crimes. That's why I brought Charles today. He's an expert at detecting this kind of setup. Charles leaned forward. Margaret, would you mind if I did a discreet search of your purse? It's just a routine precaution. Margaret knew that if she refused, it would confirm their suspicions. If she agreed, they would find the recorder. Of course, no problem. She handed her purse to Charles, who immediately found the recorder. Daniel, here it is. Daniel's face transformed from suspicion to cold anger. Margaret, or whatever your real name is, you've made a very serious mistake. Margaret tried to stay calm. Daniel, I can explain. Charles, take our friend for a private conversation. I need to make some calls. Charles stood up and firmly held Margaret's arm. Let's go, ma'am. We have a lot to talk about. Margaret looked desperately toward Richard, who immediately realized something was wrong. He stood up and began approaching, as did the undercover security. Daniel, that's not necessary. I can explain everything right here. No, I don't think you can. Charles, take her to the car. When Charles tried to force Margaret to stand up, Richard reached the table. Excuse me, is there some problem here? Daniel looked at Richard with a look of recognition. Richard Thompson. What an interesting coincidence. Your employee here was trying to frame me for something related to your missing money. Richard positioned himself between Charles and Margaret. Margaret isn't my employee. She's my partner and is acting with my full authorization. How touching. Too bad you both made a serious mistake trying to deceive me. Richard's security moved closer to the table, and the tension in the restaurant increased dramatically. Daniel, you have two options, Richard said calmly. We can resolve this civilly, or I can turn over all the evidence we've collected against you to the authorities. Daniel laughed cynically. Richard, you don't have evidence of anything, and without being able to prove I committed any crime, you'll never get your money back. Actually, we have recordings of you confessing to orchestrating the scam. We have documents with your notes, and we have Vanessa's testimony confirming everything. Daniel's expression changed drastically. Vanessa would never testify against me. She's implicated just as much as I am. Richard smiled. Daniel, you underestimated two things. First, people's loyalty when they're treated with respect. Second, a woman's determination when fighting for justice. Margaret freed herself from Charles's arm and stood by Richard's side. Daniel, Vanessa told me everything. How you manipulated her, how you promised to split the money 50-50 but only gave her 15 million, how there are at least 6 other victims. We have enough evidence to put you in prison for the next 20 years. Charles whispered something in Daniel's ear, who looked visibly shaken. What kind of deal are you proposing? Richard sat on the table, confident. It's simple. You return in full the 50 million you stole from my company. You reveal the location of the money stolen from other victims, and you confess your crimes in exchange for a reduced sentence. And if I refuse, Margaret answered before Richard, then you'll face not only criminal charges for the thefts, but also a federal investigation for international money laundering, racketeering, and aggravated fraud. Mr. Stevens calculated you could get up to 30 years in prison. Daniel looked around the restaurant, realizing he was surrounded by Richard's security and that other customers were starting to pay attention to the discussion. I need time to consider. You have until tomorrow noon, Richard replied. After that, we turn everything over to the authorities, and you lose any chance to negotiate. Daniel stood up from the table, clearly defeated. Richard, you may have won this time, but this isn't over. Margaret stepped forward. Daniel, any attempt at retaliation against Richard, against me, or against Vanessa will result in additional charges. We have everything documented and multiple copies of the evidence in secure locations. After Daniel and Charles left the restaurant, Richard hugged Margaret with relief. Margaret, you were incredible. Even when they discovered the recorder, you kept your cool and turned the situation to our advantage. Mr. Richard, I've learned that when you fight for real justice, you always find the strength to carry on. Mr. Stevens approached the table where they were. Richard, Margaret, I witnessed everything from a distance. Daniel is cornered. He'll accept the deal because he has no choice. And if he doesn't? Margaret asked. Then we proceed with Plan B. We have enough evidence for both criminal and civil cases. It might take longer, but we'll recover the money and put Daniel in jail. That night, Richard couldn't sleep thinking about everything that had happened. In 1 week, his life had completely changed. He lost 50 million but gained something far more valuable, the discovery that there were loyal and courageous people around him. At 6 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Mr. Stevens. Richard, Daniel called. He accepts the deal. Richard felt a wave of relief. What are the exact terms? Full repayment of the 50 million within 48 hours. Full confession of crimes, including information about other victims. Cooperation to recover the money stolen from others. In return, we won't press criminal charges, but he'll still have to face the federal authorities. And Vanessa? Vanessa will return the $15 million she received, will accept treatment for gambling addiction, and will fully cooperate with the investigations. In exchange, we consider that she was also a victim and will not prosecute her. Richard immediately called Margaret. Margaret, we have good news. Daniel accepted our agreement. Really? Is he going to return everything? Everything. And more importantly, you saved not only my company, but potentially several other people who were victims of his scams. Margaret was silent for a moment. Mr. Thompson, may I ask a question? Of course. When all this is over, will you really accept me as a partner? Richard smiled. Margaret, you've proven to be smarter, braver, and more loyal than any executive I've ever known. Not only will you be my partner, but you will also lead our new investigation and compliance department. And my daughter, Kathy, were you serious about helping her finish university? Margaret, Kathy will have a full scholarship, plus a guaranteed internship at the company when she graduates. And if she has half the intelligence and determination of her mother, she'll be a valuable addition to our team. Margaret began to cry on the other end of the line. Mr. Thompson, for 15 years I thought my place in life was to clean offices and be invisible. You showed me that I can be so much more. Margaret, you always had that potential. I was the one who was blind not to see it before. 2 days later, Richard was in his office when the bank manager called confirming that the $50 million had been deposited back into his accounts. Margaret entered the room, carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Mr. Thompson, I think we have something to celebrate. Richard smiled and opened the bottle. Margaret, I want to make a toast to justice, to loyalty, and to second chances. They drank in silence, contemplating the view of New York City through the office windows. Margaret, can I tell you something? Of course. When I discovered the scam, I thought I had lost everything. Not just the money, but my faith in people. You restored that faith. Margaret looked at Richard affectionately. Mr. Thompson, may I tell you something too? Go ahead. When my husband Anthony was sick and you lent me money for the medicine, it wasn't just his life you saved. It was my faith that there are still good people in the world. Richard stood up and went to the window. Margaret, I have a proposal for you. What kind of proposal? I want you to be not only my partner, but also the general director of the company. You've proven to have all the necessary qualities: intelligence, integrity, courage, and above all, the ability to see people's potential. Margaret was speechless. Mr. Thompson, I don't know if I'm prepared for so much responsibility. Margaret, you just dismantled an international criminal scheme, saved my company from $50 million in losses, and even helped other victims recover their money. If that's not enough preparation, I don't know what is. Margaret approached the window and stood beside Richard. I accept, but on one condition. What? Let's create a program at the company to identify and develop hidden talents among our employees. How many people like me might be working here without anyone noticing their potential? Richard extended his hand to Margaret. We have a deal, partner. They shook hands formally, but then Richard hugged her like a father would hug a daughter. Margaret, you've changed my life in a way I can never fully repay. Mr. Thompson, you changed mine too, and now we're going to change the lives of many other people. 3 months later, Richard and Margaret were presenting the company's annual report to investors and employees. The company had not only fully recovered from the $50 million lost, but had grown by 30%. Ladies and gentlemen, investors and employees, Richard spoke into the microphone. This was a year of extraordinary challenges, but also of extraordinary discoveries. Margaret approached the microphone. We discovered that our greatest wealth isn't in the balance sheet numbers, but in the human potential of our team. That's why we implemented continuing education programs for all employees, regardless of position or role. Richard took over again. We also created the Compliance and Investigation Department, led by our new General Director, Margaret Williams, who identified and prevented potential fraud that could have cost the company another $100 million. The audience applauded enthusiastically. Margaret, dressed in an elegant executive suit, looked like a completely different person from the cleaning lady in a blue uniform from months ago. After the presentation, Richard and Margaret were in his office reviewing the results. Margaret, can I ask you a personal question? Of course, Richard. She had stopped calling him Mr. Richard at his insistence. Do you regret leaving the simple life of a cleaning lady to take on all this responsibility? Margaret smiled. Richard, for 15 years I thought I was living a simple life. In truth, I was living an incomplete life. Now I know who I really am and what I'm capable of. And Kathy, how is she handling all these changes? Kathy is finishing her business administration course with top grades. She says she wants to follow in her mother's footsteps and work investigating corporate fraud. Richard laughed. Runs in the family, apparently. Richard, can I tell you something I found out about Vanessa? Of course. She hasn't gambled for 2 months. She's in intensive therapy, and she got a job as a consultant in addiction prevention. She called me last week to thank me for showing her that she also deserved a second chance. Richard nodded, satisfied. And Daniel Scott. He's cooperating fully with the federal authorities. He's already helped recover over $200 million stolen from other victims. He'll probably get a reduced sentence, but he'll still spend several years in prison. Richard leaned back in his chair. Margaret, do you realize that in 6 months you've transformed not only my life, but the lives of dozens of people? I didn't transform anything, Richard. I just helped people discover who they really are inside. Richard looked out the window, contemplating the city of New York City at dusk. Margaret, I have another proposal for you. Another? You never stop, do you? I want us to write a book telling this story. It could help other people going through similar situations, both victims of fraud and people who feel underestimated in their jobs. Margaret considered the idea. Actually, it's a good idea. We can donate the book profits to gambling addiction treatment programs and professional training for low-income people. Perfect. What should we call the book? Margaret thought for a moment. The Cleaning Lady Who Saved the Boss, a story of loyalty, justice, and second chances. Richard smiled. I like it, but there's a problem with the title. What? You're not my employee anymore. You're my partner, my general director, and most importantly, my friend. Margaret stood up and went to the window. Richard, can I confess something to you? Of course. For the last 15 years, every night when I left here, I looked at your office and dreamed about what it would be like to have the opportunity to show that I could be more than a cleaning lady. And now? Now I know it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about discovering my own worth. Richard joined Margaret at the window. Margaret, you want to know something? The day I discovered the scam, I thought my life was over. In truth, it was just beginning. They watched the city's movement down below, 2 people who had found in each other not just a professional partnership, but a true friendship based on mutual respect and trust. Richard, there's one last thing I need to tell you. What is it? Yesterday, I received a call from a woman in Chicago. She said her husband is falling victim to a scam similar to what Daniel Scott pulled on you. She wants our help. Richard looked at Margaret with a smile. And what did you tell her? I said we'd be there next week. After all, we now have a mission to protect honest people from criminals who take advantage of others' trust. Richard extended his hand to Margaret. Partner, I think we've started a new chapter in our lives. Margaret shook Richard's hand. Richard, I think we've started something much bigger than that. We've started a purpose. 6 months later, Richard and Margaret had created a consulting firm specialized in corporate fraud investigations. They had a team of 15 people, including Kathy, who had graduated in business administration and specialized in financial crimes. Richard's company continued to grow, but now with strict transparency policies and human development programs that became a model for other companies. Vanessa had become a speaker in gambling addiction prevention programs and maintained regular contact with Margaret and Richard. Daniel Scott was serving his 8-year sentence, but had helped recover over $500 million stolen from various victims over the years. On a Friday afternoon, Richard and Margaret were in their office reviewing the Chicago case, which they had successfully resolved, when Richard asked a question he'd been thinking about for months. Margaret, have you ever stopped to think what our lives would be like if that day you had decided not to tell me about Vanessa at the office? Margaret smiled. Richard, I've learned one thing in life. When you see injustice happening and do nothing, you become part of the problem. When you act with courage and integrity, even without knowing the outcome, you become part of the solution. Do you think we made a difference? Margaret pointed to a folder full of thank you letters from people they had helped. Richard, we didn't just make a difference. We discovered that true wealth isn't in the money we accumulate, but in the positive impact we make on other people's lives. Richard nodded, satisfied. Margaret, Can I ask you something I never have? Go ahead. Do you consider yourself a lucky person? Margaret laughed. Richard, for a long time I thought I was an unlucky person. I was widowed young, had to raise 2 daughters alone, worked humble jobs for decades. But now I understand that all of that was preparation for this moment. How so? The difficulties taught me to be observant, to value small acts of kindness, to never give up even when everything seems lost. If I hadn't gone through all that, I wouldn't have had the experience or determination to help you when you needed it most. Richard became emotional. Margaret, you completely changed my perspective on success. Before, I measured success only by profits and assets. Now I know that real success is when you can transform lives, including your own. Margaret looked out the window, contemplating the city's movement. Richard, do you know what my greatest satisfaction in all this is? What? It's not having become general director or partner of the company. It's knowing that I proved, mainly to myself, that no matter your background, your age, or current circumstances, it's always possible to reinvent yourself and discover potentials you didn't even know existed. Richard stood up and went to a framed picture on the wall of their first photo together as business partners. Margaret, do you want to know the exact moment when I realized you were special? When? It wasn't when you discovered the scam, nor when you convinced Vanessa to cooperate. It was that first day, when you said you kept the papers you found because it seemed important, but I don't understand any of these things. In that moment I realized you had something rare, humility combined with exceptional intuition. Margaret approached the painting. And do you want to know when I realized you were different from other bosses? When? When you apologized for not having listened to me before, and especially when you said I had saved not just your assets, but your dignity. In that moment, I knew I was facing a man who valued character above all else. They stood observing the photo, remembering everything they had lived through together. Margaret, I have one last request for you. What is it? I want you to promise me something. That depends on what it is. Richard smiled. Promise that you'll never underestimate yourself again. Promise that you'll always remember you're capable of extraordinary things. Margaret held Richard's hand. I promise. But only if you promise me something too. What? Promise that you'll always remember that true wealth lies in the people we choose to have by our side, and that you'll never again fail to value the hidden talents around you. Richard squeezed Margaret's hand. I promise. Outside the office, the sun was setting over New York City, ending another day in the lives of 2 people who had discovered that life's greatest treasures aren't those stolen from you, but those you gain through integrity, courage, and mutual loyalty. Margaret returned to her desk and picked up a letter that had arrived that morning. Richard, an interesting letter came today. From whom? From a company in Los Angeles. They heard about our work and want our help with a complex case of internal fraud. Richard smiled. And what do you want to do? Margaret looked at Richard with the same determined glint in her eyes that he had seen that first day when she brought the evidence against Daniel. I want to accept. After all, our mission is just beginning. Richard picked up his jacket and headed for the door. Then let's go to Los Angeles. But first, I want to stop by home to let my family know I might be late. They always worry when I go on a mission. Margaret smiled. Richard, you have a family? Yes, I do. A son who lives abroad and a sister here in New York City. But now I have something more. I have you, Kathy, and the whole team we built together. That's my family too. Margaret felt a deep emotion. Richard, thank you for giving me not just a professional opportunity but a chosen family. Margaret, thank you for showing me that family isn't just blood. It's loyalty, it's mutual care, it's being there during difficult times. When they left the building together, Richard and Margaret walked with the confidence of people who had discovered their true purpose in life. Margaret, can I ask you one last question? Go ahead. If you could go back in time and change anything in this whole story, what would you change? Margaret thought for a long moment. I would change just one thing. I would have had the courage to talk to you about my dreams and potential much sooner. Maybe we could have prevented Daniel from stealing so much money from you and other people. Richard shook his head. Margaret, I wouldn't change a thing. Every event, every difficulty, every discovery was necessary to make us the people we are today. And most importantly, to help us discover what we're capable of when we trust each other. Margaret stopped on the sidewalk and looked at Richard. Richard, can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Of course. When I was 15, when I started working as a cleaner, I promised myself that one day I would prove I was capable of so much more. It took 37 years, but I finally managed to keep that promise. Richard was moved. Margaret, you didn't just keep your promise. You inspired others to keep theirs too. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story of perseverance and loyalty. Do you believe Margaret made the right decision by risking everything to help Richard? And what would you do in her place? Leave your honest opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one.